top priority at NTSB headquarters.
The cockpit voice recorder was good quality. It was easily usable and translatable by the investigation team. The cockpit voice recorder is always just a piece of the investigation that fits many other pieces of a puzzle. It goes along with flight data, recorded data, examination of the wreckage, and all the other aspects of the investigation.
On major investigations like the crash of Egyptair 990, the NTSB works routinely with the FBI. The physical evidence has to be managed in case it's needed in court. Former FBI Assistant Director Lou Shaliro is a veteran investigator and no stranger to air crashes.
By the time Egyptair occurred, we were fairly adept at looking at airline disasters, particularly with the view of developing whether or not a terrorist incident or a criminal act had occurred.
The FBI checked for evidence of bombs, terrorists, or terrorist targets on the flight.
Trying to determine luggage against the passenger list and whether or not there was anything unusual in the manifest, whether or not the people that loaded the plane could recall anything that would have caused them concern. We reviewed surveillance tapes to indicate whether or not anything unusual was loaded on that plane. We had no evidence at all of any explosive device on board Egyptair that night.
At the NTSB, American investigators found no fault in the aircraft from studying the flight data recorder. But Egypt's members of the investigation team insisted that not all the evidence was in. Much of the wreckage was still in storage on Rhode Island. They hope the cause of the crash can be found here. Egypt's representatives search for any possible mechanical cause for the crash. While they search, other theories are pursued. A study into the causes of airline crashes published in January 2001 points to pilot error as the cause of 1/3 of these accidents. It also finds a strong connection between bad weather and pilot error. But the crash of Egyptair 990 occurred in clear weather with veteran pilots. What happened in the cockpit would divide the investigation and fuel an international controversy. The investigation develops in two directions: fault in the airplane and pilot action. Rumors swirl about what or who may have caused this terrible crash. One of the key questions: why was the relief first officer in the cockpit hours earlier than expected? He was supposed to replace Adel Anwar much later in the flight. But in Cairo, Adel Anwar's older brother Tarak has no problem with Adel being replaced in the cockpit.
Suppose I am with one of my friends and we are traveling in a car and he asks me if he can drive instead of me. Is this going to be a problem? For example, if Adel didn't get enough sleep and Captain Jamil told him, "Let me fly the plane instead of you and you go rest," there is no problem with that.
When the actions in the cockpit are put together with the voices recorded, a timeline emerges that indicates a series of initially bewildering decisions.
I'll be back to you.
The timeline reveals that after Captain El-Habashi leaves the cockpit, there's a series of sounds whose meaning can only be guessed at.
Control it.
And then the relief first officer disconnects the autopilot.
I rely on God.
Released from the autopilot's control, the plane starts to descend, rolling to the left. Egypt's experts described El Battouti's decision to shut off the autopilot as a possible reaction to an unusual movement of the aircraft, prompting him to take manual control. However, the leader of the NTSB investigation disagrees.
We found no reason for the autopilot to be disconnected by a fault or failure in the airplane.
Normally, all aircraft movements are meant to keep passengers comfortable, as though they were on the ground. After switching off the autopilot, El Battouti pushes his control column forward, lowering the elevator panels. So the flight data recorder indicates to the NTSB. Then he pulls the throttles back, reducing engine power. This causes the plane to dive. Egypt's investigators say El Battouti was not trying to crash the plane, and there may have been an elevator failure which he could not overcome. Strangely, there is no discussion of a problem on the cockpit tape. When the captain made his way back to the cockpit, he asked the first officer what was going on and never received a response. Fighting the dive, pulling his column back all the way, the captain cannot gain complete control of the elevator, so he tries the throttles to power out of the dive. He was unaware that seconds earlier the first officer had shut off the fuel to the engines. Egypt's experts say that El Battuti may have been acting out of caution. The flight data show that a low oil pressure warning appeared. That can mean the engines have flamed out. The captain may have then ordered the fuel to the engines shut off as part of the procedure for restarting the engines.
Shut the engines! It's shut!
The NTSB consider this possible scenario as well.
The engines shut off on a two-engine airplane at night over the water. We couldn't understand any reason why any emergency could cause you to shut all the power off available to the airplane when you're heading away from the nearest airport.
Foremost among the Egyptian investigators' scenarios was a tragic elevator failure. In Washington, at the National Transportation Safety Board, analysis of the flight data recorder indicates that Captain El-Habashi was pulling back on his column to make the plane climb, while First Officer El Battuti appears to be pushing forward on his column, making the plane go down. Egypt's experts argued that this crash could have been caused by a failure in the elevator assembly, producing an elevator hardover, a jam in the elevator controls which lock them in the down position, plunging the aircraft into an uncontrollable dive. They stated that First Officer El Battuti was working to regain control of the elevators, and added that he and Captain El-Habashi were working together. If there had been an elevator failure, it could explain the first officer's unusual performance in the cockpit.
Pull!
Supporting evidence is found when analyzing fragments of the wreckage in the hangar at Rhode Island. Here, investigators made a remarkable discovery: 3 unusually sheared rivets. These tiny parts play an important role in the Boeing 767 elevator assembly. Egypt's consulting experts determined that the scratches in the metal surfaces of these rivets showed that they were sheared off in 2 different directions. One direction could be attributed to the crash. The second could indicate that the break occurred before the crash, and so may have indicated a jam in the elevators. NTSB investigator Greg Phillips disagreed.
Those are by design for the Boeing 767. The controls can be split. They're designed that way in case one of the surfaces, the control surfaces, fails, so that whoever is still in control of the airplane or can control the airplane with a failed elevator.
Before he became an investigative writer, William Langewiescher was a commercial airline pilot. Flight 990's maneuvers are programmed into a flight simulator in order for Langewiescher to test a pilot's reactions.
To see an airplane going so wildly into a dive, to see the altimeters unwinding at that speed, to hear the horns and warning signals going off, is frightening.
Whatever the cause of the dive, Langewiescher tries a variety of responses to recover from it.
Finally, they asked me to wait at the extreme 15 seconds. To sit in a 767 or any airplane going out of control and do nothing for 15 seconds. 15 seconds is a long time. It's inconceivable. But I did it. And even at 15 seconds, even waiting 15 seconds, I was able, through no particular skill, really reacting almost as any student pilot would, to recover the airplane, recover from the dive, before the airplane exceeded its limits.